welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Well, yes, as you see there, we'll be starting off with the privatization of the power holding company of Nigeria. You do know that they've been handed over to successor companies, and the Bureau of Public Enterprises, yes, the BPE, also involved in this one. Well, joined now by the Director General of the BPE, Mr. Benjamin Dikki, who joins us from our studios in Abuja. Morning, and thank you for joining us today. Because, I mean, in the thick of all of this, you do know that Labour was up in arms about all of this. There were threats of protests, strikes, shutdown. And as a matter of fact, one of the headlines yesterday, if I remember properly, was that imminent shutdown or blackout, blackout imminent. That was one of the headlines. So, but at the end of the day, they've been handed over. Perhaps I should even start by asking you, now that all of this is done, do you think that this handover process, the whole thing went smoothly? Are you positive that at the end of the day, this was the right thing to do?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure being on channels. The handover process was a historic process. It's one day in the life of this nation where epochal achievements have been recorded. Firstly, that is the day when the public sector handed over the power sector to the private sector. Now, what is the implication of that? We have to look at what has happened in the reform of the telecom sectors for us to appreciate the magnitude of what is happening and what is going to happen to the power sector. When the telecom sector was liberalized and the private sector was introduced, we moved from having 450,000 lines to over 123 million lines. Record have it that over $40 billion have been invested by the various telecommunications outfits in Nigeria. They have created jobs, they have created reliability in service. Once you hand over a sector to the private sector and create the enabling environment, you will see a revolution in that sector. So we are looking out for a revolution in the power sector by the mere introduction of the private sector into that very important sector of the Nigerian economy. Secondly, it is the introduction of accountability and transparency in the collection of revenues in the value chain in the power sector. What do I mean? Previously, generation was a department in NEPA and subsequently PHCN. Distribution was also another department. When the department that generates power and transmits it to the distribution company, they don't bother what happens to the power. Does it get paid for? Do some of it get lost on the way? Nobody bothers. Those who are also distributing to the last mile users, they distribute the power. Some of it is used and not paid for. Nobody cares. But now, by the separation of generation from distribution, the ownership is by different companies and individuals. When somebody generates power now, he will issue a bill and he expects to collect his money back. He sells the power to those who are distributing. Those who are distributing, you are already collecting the power at a cost, which means you have to pay for it. So when you distribute it to the end users, the households and the corporations, you collect your money back. If you don't, you are already losing money. So this has introduced transparency in the power value chain. Revenues that are expected to be collected will be collected because this is now business. People now own this business, they invested in it, and they expect to make a return. So there will be accountability and transparency in the power value chain. Another issue that happened that day is that government has now been freed from the responsibility of financing and budgeting those 14 companies that were handed over. This responsibility has now moved on to the new private sector owners. Government doesn't have to invest in these companies again. It has been handed over, and the ingenuity of the private sector will now move on to drive the growth in this sector. So we are on to a very epochal and what people will call a watershed in the history of this country. History has been made, and we're going to see a transformation in the Nigerian economy, because power has constituted a significant portion of the cost of doing business in Nigeria, especially big companies and big factories that have to generate power from on their own. They leave the main business of producing their products and now have to start generating power. It's a diversion. Now, in the next few months, few years, we're going to see an increase in the power supply. We're going to see improvement in the efficiency of distribution, and people will now focus on their core businesses and not be diverted by having to be generating companies in addition to doing their own business.
Yeah, but Mr. Dikki, I mean, perhaps you might have heard of the opinion of some who think that perhaps it's not exactly a good idea for the government to hands off completely power generation in the country, because some of them thought that, what about the security implication of that if everything were to be at the hands of the private sector?
Well, this was the argument that was given for telecommunications. That once you allow private sector into the telecom sector, security will be an issue. There will be challenges for security. The nation will be exposed, and all those kind of arguments that don't add up. We've seen the telecom sector being owned by the private sector, and the Nigerian security situation has not in any way been impaired. Similarly, we're going to see investments in the power sector in a magnitude that government cannot on its own be able to raise that kind of capital. Imagine if government was to raise the $40 billion that had gone into the telecom sector. How many years will it take the Nigerian government to budget for that? Even if it concentrated only on telecoms, it will not be able to meet that budget given the threshold of our national budget in the next 5 years. So people bring up these issues, but the fact remains that other countries' power sector are run by the private sector. Their security has not been in any way challenged. What will happen is that there will be opportunities unleashed in the private sector, for the private sector, by their participation in the power sector. And I do not see or foresee any security challenge by government taking its hands off power. But the way it is structured now, government is not going to go out of power immediately, because government is planning that the proceeds from the sale of the NIPP plants will be plowed back to other sources of energy like hydro, like renewable energy, like solar. So it will take some time for government to completely move out of the power sector, but that is the desired destination.